Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the 22nd meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2025. Apologies this morning from our convener Colette Stevenson and Michael Mara. Unfortunately, neither of them can be with us this morning. We move to agenda item 2. Agenda item was previously held in private, which is a decision to another item in private. Is the committee agreed to the agenda item 4 in private at today's meeting? We move to agenda item 3 on pre-budget scrutiny. And this is our second evidence session. I would like to welcome Chris Burt, Associate Director for Scotland Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Stephen Sinclair, Chair Poverty and Equality Commission, Emma Jackson, Head of Social Justice, Citizens Advice Scotland, who are with us in the room this morning, but also a thank you to Adele Harris, OBE, Chair of the Independent Review of Adult Disability Payment, who's with us online this morning. So all four of you, thank you very much for budget scrutiny, the support you're going to give us this morning. So I've got an opening question. We know there's been a significant amount of monies invested in social security in Scotland, and the budget is dramatically increasing, but if you like, in a controlled fashion, because of policy intentions. So, for example, the Scottish Child Payment is an additional £489 million as of next year. Disability payments will be £452 million above the block grant adjustment. Additional monies in carers allowance is additional £123 million. Mitigating UK policies in relation to discretionary housing payments is £100 million, and the forthcoming two-child cap mitigation is £155 million. So we can very quickly see how that all stacks up to a huge amount of money, more than block grant adjustments. So I wanted to put that on the record. Whilst it's welcome, what we need to make sure is that we've got evidence that the impact of that significant investment is having the kind of impact we'd want it to, if you would like. So can I ask for witnesses, perhaps picking one of those or another, where is the evidence that that additional investment is having the impact that we'd like to see? And where it's not, as in the evidence is not there, is that an evidence gap which we have to collect data, or does that mean we have to do something else? So quite a lot in that, but I thought that would start us off in our evidence session this morning. Anyone want to go first? Mr Sinclair, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to the work of the committee. I'm very glad, Convener, that you referred to it as investment and referred to the purposes of some of these social security expenditures. The Social Security Act rightly describes social security as an investment in the people of Scotland. So in contrast to much of the discussion that surrounds this, I'm glad you're not focusing, as it were, on the cost and regarding this as an unwarranted expenditure. In terms of the impact, we have excellent evidence now, and it's growing, of the impact of the Scottish Child Payment. This committee produced a report on that last year. We've seen some of the impact of that already in the annual child poverty statistics published this year. So much of the 4% decrease in the headline figure of relative child poverty is attributable to the Scottish Child Payment. In addition to that, there is a lot of testimony from the Commission's Experts by Experience panel, Poverty Truth Commissions and other sources about the value of the Scottish Child Payment to parents. It's really addressing deficiencies long-standing deficiencies in the social security system, particularly the two-child limit, benefit cap under occupation penalty, and the deficiencies of universal credit. So it's stopping much worse things happening. In that sense, it's an investment in the long-term well-being of children. And I think there's, as I say, a wide range of evidence testifying to that.
Thank you. Other witnesses want to come in? Emma Jackson.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, committee, for having me this morning. I think I want to begin by just echoing what Stephen is saying about social security being an investment, not just in the people that need to access the payments, but social security is an investment indeed in all of us, our whole society and our whole economy. It should exist to provide both a safety net and a springboard for the times in life where unexpected things are happening to us and we need to be caught, but it should also be there to enable all of us to realise realise our potential and to step into more positive destinations. And we can see that the social security payments that we have here in Scotland are acting to do both of those things, to be both a safety net and indeed a springboard. From the work of the Citizens Advice Network across Scotland, we would absolutely agree that the Scottish Child Payment is acting as a complete lifeline and making a marked difference to the families that are in receipt of it. There is well-documented evidence about the difference that it's making, but from our experience from having those conversations with families time and time again, they will be able to attest to the difference that it's making. Families being able to turn the heating on so the house is warm before children come home from school, so that good and healthy and nutritious food can be bought, that children can attend school trips. These are the type of things that it's making a meaningful impact. The Citizens Advice Network is also, out with Social Security Scotland, the largest provider of ADP advice here in Scotland. Just in Q1 of this year, we provided advice over 20,000 times to people, and we're able to work alongside individuals to secure more than £7 million of ADP payments to individuals. And again, time and time again, our advisors will talk about the very real positive impact that ADP makes in individual lives, not just in terms of the material benefit that it makes to people's lives as they deal with additional costs of being disabled, but more importantly, the whole process by which individuals have to navigate the system. Individuals will say that the ADP process is markedly different from previous experiences with PIP, and the fact that we have a system that is rooted in dignity, fairness and respect really does make a difference to people's lives. We know that the payments can be absolutely transformative for those who get ADP advice from the Citizens Advice Network. Around a quarter are in work, so that's a payment that's enabling people to realise their potential and to participate in work. But moreover, we know that individuals will report things like it enables them to have a social life and to be able to be involved and connect with their communities. One person really sort of told our advisors, if I didn't have ADP, I'd be Johnny Napals and not able to go anywhere. So I think it's important that we capture the huge richness and value that payments like these make to people's lives.
Thank you very much. I think because disability payments were mentioned, it would be appropriate to Adele Harris in next. I think we'll have something meaningful to say, I've no doubt, on this also. So Adele, what is the evidence we have? Because we see that investment. What is the evidence we have that that is making a real difference? And if there are gaps, because one of the gaps I think we had last week, but Emma addressed some of that, we weren't sure how many people claiming adult disability payment were actually in work vis-a-vis to out of work. We got some of that from Emma there. Where are there gaps? We need more information. Would be quite helpful, Adele.
Yes, thank you. I mean, in my experience of doing this review, which took place over 18 months, I found plenty of kind of qualitative evidence and stories, and some of the things that were just said there about the difference that the approach in Scotland is having. But there appears to be very little or no research or real hard data available that relates to the impact on people's lives or circumstances as a result of the investments made in adult disability payment in Scotland. So I'm not talking about the difference the payment itself makes, but more I'm talking about the impact of the spending over and above in Scotland. So there's obviously been investments and there's evidence to back this up to improve the systems and the approach and the processes, as well as the investment in areas like the take-up strategy. So we've got to assume, therefore, that one of the reasons that the numbers are as they are is because of that investment in advertising the benefit and really working hard to make sure people know it's there and that they take up the opportunity to get ADP. I know, of course, that we're all awaiting the publication of the Audit Scotland report, which might address some of this, might answer some of these questions. But you'll see within my report that in terms of the approach that's taken in Scotland and the practices of Social Security Scotland, I think there's plenty of qualitative evidence to suggest that those changes are having a positive impact. That includes things like the cessation of assessments, short-term assistance being available, which obviously is not the case across the UK or with the DWP when appealing a decision. And I think in terms of other data gaps, again, from my experience of doing this review, we don't know how many disabled people there are in Scotland. And by disabled people, I include those living with a long-term health condition. So that's a very obvious kind of data gap. And I think if the purpose of ADP is to cover the additional costs, then more work could be done to understand what those are. I do note the scope report that came out in 2025, I think that's referenced in my report. But I really feel that we need to understand more what those additional costs are. So those would be my main sort of data gaps.
That's very helpful. Chris Burt.
Yeah, I'll align myself with Stephen and Emma's comments on the purpose of social security, so I'll not repeat that. But I mean, in terms of data gaps, I mean, I think I've raised in front of this committee before, I've maybe written to you on it as well. I am concerned about the quality of the family resources survey. It's one of the things which we, it is how we measure the child poverty reduction targets. The sample sizes are very small. It stops us from looking into the effects in different households of poverty, etc. So that is a worry, and I think I would like to see both the DWP and the Scottish Government take that a bit more seriously. But I think as well is, for example, we saw in the context of the UK Government's proposed reforms to PIP, is we don't know in Scotland, for example, the interaction between ADP and the health elements of UC. That would be extremely valuable information for us to have for reasons which all my fellow panel members have set out. So I do think there is some kind of foundational evidence that would help us. But, I mean, we've done lots of modelling in this space, things like the Scottish Child Payment. That's why we believe that Scotland is the only part of the UK that will have falling child poverty by the end of this decade. So it is having an impact. But that Family Resources Survey, the robustness of that is incredibly important both to this Parliament and to policy making. I think is something that we should be concerned about.
Okay. Now, a positive impact, yes. Massive investment, yes. But is it value for money? So that's the next question we have to ask, of course, because clearly if we spend huge amounts of money to tackle child poverty, to support those with disabilities, to support carers, it is going to have an impact, and it's going to have a positive impact, but we have to ask if it's value for money. So any comments on whether if the policy intent, for example, was to tackle poverty, support disabled people and carers, are these suite of measures, is it good value for money? Who would like to comment on that? Mr Sinclair.
In terms of the Scottish Child Payment, which I'll principally focus on because that's our statutory remit within the Poverty and Inequality Commission, there's more expert people here about ADP and disability. Fraser Wallander Institute, I know you had testimony from them last week, they've done some modelling which shows that of the available viable options, the Scottish Child Payment is the most efficient and effective way of delivering on the child poverty targets. There is no path to the 2030 targets which does not involve significant, substantial, sustained investment in social security. That's just a nettle that has to be grasped or an opportunity that has to be taken depending on one's point of view. That will raise revenue issues which we perhaps are going to talk about. But of the instruments that could be introduced, a new benefit wouldn't be more efficient and effective than the Scottish Child Payment. So I do think it's delivering, and it's delivering value for money, and it's the principal resource that we have in order to address the child poverty targets. We can't talk about other non-social security activities. They have to supplement this, but there is no lever that's going to have the same direct impact. Even if we get the best case scenario, people into employment, even reduce costs of living and increase the affordable supply of housing, we're talking there about 1 or 2% each contribution to reducing the relative child poverty headline figure. Scottish Child Payment alone has contributed about, large bulk of the 4% decrease. In combination with other activities, it could get us significantly closer to the 2030 targets. So we really need to address that challenge.
Okay. Now, I sometimes feel that the heft of the Scottish Child Payment is so significant that other investments somehow become the poor relations in terms of scrutiny. And assessing whether there's value for money or not. So it's not that I don't want to hear more about the Scottish Child Payment, but I would quite like to hear more about whether other investments are value for money or not. Chris Birch.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, it comes back to what you value, and I'll not labour the point on the child payment, but if you read some of the testimony as well in the Scottish Government's evaluation of the 5 family payments, if you value children living in homes where there is food on the table and warmth, etc., then it is a very good investment. And I think in terms of things like the 2-child limit, reversing that too, I think that's very good value for money, because we see increases, the proportion of children in poverty within large families is consistently increasing, and reversing that will have a massive impact. And I think in terms of the amount of additional investment they'll get, in terms of the direct impact on families, I think that's very good value for money.
Okay, is there any, and I should ask this, Emma, I will take you in, and this is my last question, because Jeremy wants to have a supplementary, and my colleagues will all want to come in for a whole range of questions as well. Is there any payments that are not value for money? Sorry, Emma.
You're okay.
You can swerve that if you like, but
I was maybe just going to bring some reflections in terms of your question about sort of value in relation to some of the disability and health, I guess, related payments. And I will repeat again that social security is an investment in all of us, and indeed is a human right. And what has been invested so far is absolutely essential to be addressing the harm that groups across our society in Scotland have been forced to endure because of systematic kind of failure and systemic issues. And not only is what we've been provided sort of value for money, but we indeed need to go further. We know that disabled people disproportionately face some of the worst of poverty that people experience in Scotland. Our evidence would show that from across the Citizens Advice Network, with over 2/3 of all of the people who come and seek advice from a local CAB having a disability or long-term health condition and needing advice across kind of multiple areas to be able to do that. And the payments that are made are absolutely essential in going, and I would say some of the way, to tackle the harm that people experience. But as I said, we know that disabled people do face exceptionally high costs just to navigate additional or not to navigate life. And one of the things that we haven't looked at so far is the adequacy of the disability payments that are made. A comprehensive and excellent review of ADP was carried out, but out of scope of that was adequacy. And whilst what we're doing is good, we absolutely need to be going further if we're really to tackle the harm that sick and disabled people face.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to bring you in for some supplementaries. I think it might be reasonable when you ask your question for Adele to comment on some of this, given the previous comments we've had as well. But Jeremy, over to you.
Yeah, once you hear my question, you might not want to take it. But can I welcome a panel? Thank you for coming. And I absolutely agree with everything you said so far in regard to its investment in art. And I should also just remind members that I'm on ADP myself. I suppose going back to maybe Chris and Emma and others, we want to focus this on the most needy people in society. We want those who are the most vulnerable to be able to get the most. But any social investment comes with a cost, and you know we've all seen the figures of where the money is going to go in the next few years. I'm just wondering, is there any thought of targeting this better, so that perhaps people who are on higher incomes, particularly around ADP, might not get it? Now, I know there's issues in regard to how do we actually do that and passporting benefits, but as a principle, would it be better to take that social investment and give more to those in need, rather than necessarily someone like myself, who is on a reasonably good salary, and use the money in a more different way? I'm just wondering if any thought has been done around that kind of thinking.
Who's that to, Jeremy?
Anyone at all? Really happy to go.
Stephen.
I would say that we need to broaden the discussion and analysis well beyond social security. There is a wide range of choices that have to be taken. There's choices I've already made which have not been directed at the most needy and have the greatest value for money. These are choices the Scottish Government, of course, are entitled to make, but there has to be a rationale and a justification for that. And they have to tie up their commitment to the eradication of child poverty, which is welcome and been repeated, and some of their actions. So, for example, the pension aid winter heating payment, There are good reasons for that, but is it directed most efficiently and effectively at the most needy? Should we target by demography, or should we target by other circumstances? Similarly, concessions on travel for everyone over 60. That's a very expensive policy in the long term. Is that targeted at the most needy? Again, there may be other justifications for doing that, but the Scottish Government have to be held to account, and the Scottish Parliament as well, for those sorts of decisions. So I think it's important to broaden it, and I agree with the principle, focus on need and the value added of any expenditure.
Chairman, I'm deferring to yourself.
Well, I think Emma might want to come in. I don't know. You were nodding. I don't know whether you want to say or not.
Happy just to come in briefly. I think Stephen raises a really important point about sort of broadening the conversation, because when we think about ADP, yes, it's an additional costs payment to try to meet the additional costs that disabled people face. I think in the fullness of a conversation like that, we need to look at what are the other ways that we can remove the barriers that disabled people face in society and tackle other issues in the right places. For example, I would refer to the very high energy costs that disabled people face. And actually what we need to be doing across the policy portfolio is tackling issues as far upstream as possible and looking at the solutions in the right place. The solution there is the fact, or the issue there rather, is that we have broken energy markets and we need a social tariff that would help greatly for those who are on low incomes or have unavoidable high use. So I think it's right to highlight a full conversation to make sure that we're tackling issues at source and not propping up failure demand.
Okay, thank you. Alexandra?
It's been quite enlightening for me, who's relatively new to the committee, to hear where we are this morning. But Emma, you talked about, when you spoke to the conveners' questions, that 20,000 people had been supported through the Citizen Advice to receive or progress to ADP. Now, that's quite a large number to contend with. And was that because they weren't aware, or were they signposted by your organisation to find that? Because there has been quite a large campaign to try and identify individuals. So it would be a good flavour as to why they felt it was your organisation that was going to help them through that process.
Absolutely. So just for absolute clarity, in case I wasn't clear, it was we provided advice 20,000 times during that period. So there will be individuals who came kind of multiple times without that. I think the Citizens Advice Network is a household brand that people trust. We have a footprint in almost every community in Scotland, and hopefully a wide and open door so people can come along with the smallest question that they might have, right the way through to, could you draw alongside me and help me sort of to fill that out? And that's an essential service that our advisors are sort of providing week in, week out. Undoubtedly, our advisors would attest that the ADP process, since we've began that here in Scotland, is a smoother and better journey than previous experience with PIP, for example. But that's not to say that progress couldn't be made for that to be a better journey for the individuals who are applying for the payments, and also for our advisors for working alongside it. A colleague was on the expert group who worked alongside Adele on the ADP review, and there's definitely room for improvement there, and indeed Social Security Scotland are committed to continuous improvement. So I think there's opportunities for progress to be made. But I think the final thing I would say about this is that unfortunately I think that disabled people and people who are ill continue to experience some of the worst stigma and shame piled upon them for needing to access payments like that. I think the rhetoric that we have had over the last 6 months as we saw the welfare reforms pass through the UK Parliament has quite simply been outrageous. Disabled people have felt dehumanised, devalued, and actually quite worthless has been some of the phrases that people have said. And so actually we would see it as a positive thing that we are actively playing our role to enable people to access payments that they are entitled to. And we were happy to do everything we can to make sure people get the payments that they need.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Move on to Marie McNair, but Marie, I'm just conscious Adele Harris has not had the opportunity to just comment some of the things that, to her fingertips, you've been involved in very recently. Did you have any final comments in this section, Adele, before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, because I sort of echo a lot of what's already been said. Obviously, looking at means testing or was out of scope of the review, so I just want to make that very clear. But what was interesting in meeting so many disabled people and people living with long-term health conditions during the course of the review is that several people exclude themselves from applying for ADP because of the stigma. Others who would say, I'd rather the money went to, people who deserve it more. So there's a little bit of that kind of self-removal from the process happening anyway, sometimes for quite negative reasons, which is sad to see when you hear those individual stories. But I think I would try and answer that question really, assuming that the principle of this being a payment that's given to people to cover the additional costs of disability, that obviously means testing doesn't come into that. And the final point would be to do with the eligibility criteria. Obviously, I have no idea at the moment whether the Scottish Government will accept all or some of my recommendations, and we may come on to this later in the conversation. But some of the recommendations are, yes, about improving the current system, but the more radical ones, if you like, are about reviewing the eligibility criteria. And ultimately, this payment should always be given to people who evidence through their application process, through their supporting information, they evidence the need for the payment. And so I would just leave that point sort of hanging there, really. If you need it, then you should, as a human right, be eligible to receive it.
Thanks, Adele. Marie McNair.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Adele, can I just follow up? Obviously, thanks for your review of ADP, and obviously I look forward to the Scottish Government response. On the issue of policy, you're aware that the UK Government are moving to have entitlement of PIP as a route, obviously to the health element of UC. Do you have any concern that sort of the big changes to ADP may impact on how it's viewed as a passport to the UC health element for the Scottish claimants?
Yes, I do. And again, I tried to make this point clear in my report, that the whole area of passporting, even actually before the UK Government talked about welfare reform and the work capability assessment and the health element of universal credit. So obviously that came quite late in the timeline of conducting my review. But passporting was always something that needed to be considered. And I recognised that obviously if the UK Government make changes to PIP, whether that's to eligibility or any other element of the personal independence payment, that will have an impact on people in Scotland, and vice versa. If the Scottish Government does accept any of the recommendations and want to make some fundamental changes to what I describe as the PIP framework that we still use for ADP, then that could potentially impact on the arrangement between the UK Government and the Scottish Government. So one of the points I make in the report, and this came from disabled people themselves very loudly and very clearly, was if there are going to be changes that potentially will have an impact, then the principle should be that nobody is negatively impacted. Now, it's for people much cleverer than me, more knowledgeable than me, to work out how that is done in practice. But it would be awful if, as a result of this review and any changes that may be made, if disabled people in Scotland are worse off financially as a result of those changes.
No, it is extremely concerning. It's something that we need to look at. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Emma, obviously back to yourself on ADP. Obviously in your written submission you highlighted a client who describes the experience of claiming ADP as being amazing compared to PIP. Can you say anything about the policy differences that obviously contributed to them saying it's an amazing experience?
I think, as I've already mentioned, I think people, as they apply and receive ADP, are able to tangibly experience what it looks like to engage with an organisation that is values-based. time and time again, we would hear people say that the principles of dignity, fairness and respect are what they experience as they go throughout their journey. Many people would speak about, through previous PIP payments and stuff like that, a real sense of being re-traumatised as they have to continually retell their story or feel challenged around how they're describing their day-to-day lives and the needs that they have. And so I think we have fundamentally kind of shifted the paradigm by anchoring the whole process in a values-based way that helps people to understand from the beginning that this is a right to be able to access this, and you're going to work with an agency that would be able to do that. I mean, it would be remiss of me not to say that there are not challenges sometimes. Our advisors are very much on the end forefront of that with people, particularly as they're perhaps working alongside individuals to challenge decision making. We do support folks to go through redeterminations. But I think we absolutely have to acknowledge the very real difference of having a values-based approach to payments like ADP and all of the payments from Social Security Scotland.
Oh, absolutely, thank you. In relation to the Social Security spend, it's said that it's going to be like 30% higher by the end of the decade. Do you feel that the 30% statements simplifies a more complex explanation? Is it not the case that there's one reason is that the part of the increase is just reflecting the fact that the Scottish Government are just taking on the responsibility of the spend that's already been there to the Westminster level? You know, for example, attendance allowance obviously transferring over to the pension age disability, and obviously the industrial injuries benefit going to EIA. Yes.
If I could come in that first. I mean, firstly, while the 30% figure is accurate, I mean, I think the SPICE document also highlights that the block grant adjustment will also rise significantly over that period. So I think the thing which, I mean, like some of the questions have been being concerned about it, as I said in our response, I'm not concerned about it because these have been, in the main, positive choices by the Scottish Government to do things that we support. So the changes that you've heard to how ADP is handled, if that increases people applying because they are less put off than they would be by a DWP system, good. That's a policy success. I mean, but I think we should, just on that, like, and I met David Wallace recently and said this, like, I'm not sure that comparing Social Security Scotland with the DWP is that useful a benchmark anymore. I think we should aspire to better. I mean, in terms of the other things like the child payment, the two-child cap mitigation of bedroom tax, all of these things are positive choices by the Scottish Government. That's what devolution is for. Now, it creates spending pressures, as I'm sure we'll come on to discuss, but that's politics. That's what this Parliament is there to do. And so if the Scottish Government is making positive choices to make those changes, good. And then we can discuss how to pay for them.
Obviously, in your report, Meeting the Moment, obviously there's the proposal to increase the take-up from 87% to 100%. Can you say what policy change or system change would be needed to do that? And obviously, you'd be relying on the UK's cooperation on that.
Yeah, I think so. And don't get me wrong, I think we have seen some positive moves from the UK government in terms of trying to encourage people to apply for things that they're eligible for, which of course they should. But I don't think we should ever consider the job of increasing take-up as done. We should be pushing it. So how the Scottish Government do that through all public services, not just on responsibility of Social Security Scotland. You know, there are excellent organisations like Citizens Advice and other third sector advice services. So again, showing the value of advice too. I mean, investing in advice, Emma will thank me for saying this, but is great value for money because it gets people money that they're eligible to and deserve.
No, absolutely. And I think it kind of, I believe there's kind of a wider duty for us all really to carefully explain, you know, the budget increase and obviously, you know, any concerns that, you know, that the figure has been sort of hijacked or undermined the positives really of investing, as you said before, in Social Security. Anybody else want to come in or Stephen?
Can I just say also there is quite good economic evidence that increasing uptake has a local economic multiplier effect. People on low income spend their income, they spend it locally, it's better for local services. Also, I think in terms of supplementing the excellent work of Citizens Advice, using intermediate organisations, particularly for groups who are a bit marginalised, black minority ethnic communities, they are an excellent conduit and a way of paving the way to what are citizens' rights, after all.
It's quite interesting that the SPICE document last week, obviously, in terms of the carer support payment, and obviously the sort of lack of take-up from those from ethnic minorities. Absolutely.
I was going to say that was something we highlighted in our Poverty in Scotland report last year. There's been significant fall of the proportion of families from minority ethnic background receiving social security. And as you know, I mean, almost 50% of children in those families are in poverty. That doesn't kind of add up. Now, there may be data quality issues in there as well, but it should also be something both the UK and Scottish governments are worried about.
Thank you.
Colleagues have very kindly done the heavy lifting to demonstrate the value of advice when we think about accessing social security payments, and that's of course not just the Citizens Advice Network but all of the advice organisations in Scotland. And so I think it's really important for us to remember that any conversation that we're having about investment in social security, we need to talk about investment in advice services as well. Unfortunately, there is huge precarity in the funding of advice. Local cabs and many services run from one-year funding cycles, which is just hugely doesn't make economic sense. And so we need to keep moving towards a sustainable and long-term funding cycle for our advice services.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'll hand back. I'll maybe come in later.
No, absolutely. And I think in the interest of not having the wrath of the convener who's not here just now, I should say that our committee has done quite a significant report on multi-year funding for third sector and voluntary organisation. The government has been responding positively to that, but we'll continue to follow that as a committee. I've done that for you, Colette, so don't get into trouble. Carol Mockin.
Thank you, convener. I want to just move a wee bit maybe to some of the things you said we might touch on later, and the sort of the important investment in ending child poverty and the targets for 2030. And I just wonder if the panel, can we meet those targets? And I suppose touch on what Chris mentioned about the spending pressures around that. What are the spending pressures around that? And can we, should we, how do we meet those costs? Chris?
Yeah, I can come in first. I mean, I think there's a few things to reflect upon here. Firstly, and I looked this up before I came, is the child poverty targets were unanimously agreed by Parliament. Any MSP who was in Parliament in 2017 voted for them. I don't know how we thought they would be met without significant additional public investment in reducing child poverty. But maybe I'm just not smart enough, but I don't think it's possible, right? And I think the investment that we've seen in the child payment is big. It will and is making a difference, but we do have to go further. And that's what our Meeting the Moment report was about. It's about trying to say to folk is, we're not telling you, we're not going to write your manifestos for you. There are different ways to do this. And absolutely, social security is not the only solution to this. There are other solutions as well, which require just as much effort. And for effort, read investment. We have to change how our economy works. Having relative poverty below 10% means a significant change to the world that we have today. It means redistributing money within our economy to people on lower incomes. There are different ways of doing that. But we do then have to look, we have to ask fundamental questions, which is welcome to see the committee looking at, around targeted versus universal support, the tax burden within our country. I mean, the UK does not, compared to the rest of the world, have a particularly high tax burden. But the Scottish Parliament obviously has a restricted fiscal movement in terms of the taxes they have it. But we do, if we want to change society, which I think if you voted for those targets, you want to change the society we have today. 1 in 4, I mean, I could do a speech about it if you want, but, look one up. Yeah, we do have to, and we have to look at things like I noticed in the session last week, we talked about council tax, for example, and it was talked about as if we haven't done council tax because we can't. Rubbish. Absolutely rubbish. We can change council tax. We can't change it overnight, can't change it tomorrow, but we can change it. And frankly, each of the political parties in this Parliament, and obviously the SNP have been in power for a long time, we can change council tax. We should. It's regressive. It punishes poorer households. That's something we just have to take on. And we could look at it in a way which reduces the burden on low-income families, and that would have a positive impact on poverty. And we could look at it in a way that would increase the spending power of the Scottish Government and local government. So these are things we have to take on.
Okay. Emma's nodding. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Chris is right that there are many things that we could and must be doing to meet the targets, but I think it's really important for us to catch as well that there is no credible way to meeting the target without significant further investment in social security. That is something that we absolutely must grapple with. I think it's really important as well for us to recognise that as well as the legally binding targets as well, public attitudes tell us that people in Scotland want the government, want the Parliament to take action on child poverty and bring about a better future for all of our children. There is public appetite and desire to do that, and that therefore demands that our Parliament should be taking action on delivering these things. In terms of where or how that sort of spend comes, I think we need to look at the distribution of existing budgets to target support at those who really are experiencing most harm so that we can meet these targets. We've got the legally binding targets, and also we have the Scottish Government outlining that eradicating child poverty is the #1 mission of this government. So if that's what the priorities and the targets are, then we need to see budget allocations that match that ambition so that action can be delivered upon. And then, as Chris has indicated, we need to look at taking every other possible lever to raise further revenue. Taxation is a really vital tool for tackling inequality, and opportunities exist. They might be difficult, but they do exist to look at wealth and land taxes and how they might be useful. Organisations like Tax Justice Scotland are presenting lots of solutions that could be interrogated in this space so that we could take every single opportunity that we could to generate the revenue that we know would make a difference.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to come in, Stephen?
Just to echo the point on taxation, the Poverty and Equality Commission, before I joined it, so I will say I can praise this report without any embarrassment, offered a range of options which are within Scottish Government's powers and some options which would require agreement with the UK Government for raising revenue. So I commend that. Also, the Minimum Income Guarantee Expert Group identified a number of tax revenue activities which could raise, I think it was £0.8 billion to meet some of the demands of this. I think it's also very important to reiterate that it's not good enough for the Parliament to will an outcome without taking the action. So we have a unanimous commitment and repeated statements that eradicating child poverty is the first priority of Scotland. And that's excellent. But then we have to execute that. The previous scrutiny report published by the Poverty and Equality Commission 2024 called for a cross-party convention or conversation on this so that we can put to one side the potential political hazards of addressing toxic issues such as council tax. No one wants to be the first mover on that because of political consequences which can follow that. But we all know that it's an indefensible system basing tax on property values of 1991. I mean, that's an embarrassment that we still have that. And I understand the political hazards of engaging that debate, but it's a sort of issue that needs to be addressed seriously. And one other thing I do have to emphasise is that, yes, addressing child poverty can be a short-term expense, but not addressing poverty is a long-term catastrophe for Scotland's economy and Scotland's people. The Institute of Public Policy Research just estimated that the health impacts alone of dealing with the consequences of child poverty are something over £2 billion. That's failure demand, as Emma pointed out. OK, yes, there is a short-term investment required, but the long-term payoffs are considerable for people and for all of us. So I think it's within the capacity of this Scottish Parliament to definitely meet the targets. That's non-negotiable. Unless you want to repeal the Act, that has to be something that we do.
Thank you. Adele, do you want to add anything? I've got one more short question.
There's not an awful lot that I can add, because obviously the review that I have conducted was very focused on people's experiences of ADP, and I didn't look wider at sort of issues to do with Scottish Government policies on poverty. But I'll just say one brief thing. One factor or driver for the increased demand across the whole of the UK, actually not just in Scotland, for disability payments is, of course, the ongoing cost of living crisis. And I accept, obviously, there's a combination of factors. That's not the only driver. And then the point really, which is an obvious one, that if we invest in adults who care for children, assuming that, you know, a number of claimants of ADP have children of their own, then that in and of itself will support that child poverty agenda.
Thank you, thank you. I've just got one last wee thing about how we get that balance right between what we're hearing is we've got to get that, you know, money to people, the additional payments, but there are other stuff that we need to do. So can we just remind ourselves of what other stuff is really important that we also do to meet those targets?
Sure. I mean, I think there is just one thing to balance. I was at an event just earlier this week with our member of the EIS was speaking. He was a nursery teacher, and he worked somewhere in Lanarkshire. And the first hour of the day they spent, often with many of the kids there, was making sure they had food, clean nappies, clean clothes. Households don't have enough money. Social Security puts that money into households. It's a crucial part of it. But yeah, I mean, there are the longer term things are things like education and the quality of that. Absolutely. But it's not a zero-sum game. You can do both. But I think the other things directly in the targets, housing. We need to see, again, I think the FRS is ropey on its housing affordability data when we see it in temporary accommodation figures, etc. But really good high volume of social housing, which is energy efficient, which is all of these things, keeps down household costs. It's one of the main reasons child poverty is lower in Scotland compared to England and Wales in particular. And then how we support people into work. And then I think it is really worth looking at the different priority families, which the Scottish Government have identified. So how do we support disabled people? How do we support single parents? The solutions are not necessarily the same. Some of them are. So childcare is a massive solution to all of these things. I think we cannot rest now on the childcare system that we have today because it's not open up enough. We need to work intensively with families to support them, with employers to create greater flexibility. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that these solutions are kind of wild and innovative and all these things. So, for example, in Fife Gingerbread have worked with local care homes to create new shift patterns between 10 and 2 o'clock for single parents, so that single parents can take kids to school, to nursery, work in the care homes. That allows the people doing the early and back shifts to get a break in the middle of the day, creates a better service for the people in those care homes, creates income for those parents, creates a healthier home life for those kids. Like, it's a win-win. It's not rocket science. There are things we can do, but you have to try. You have to get people out into communities and supporting them, and so much of that stuff has been wound back over the last 10, 15 years.
Stephen.
You're right. We don't want to just hang everything on Social Security, although I do have to emphasise it's the principal lever. It's the most immediate effect as well. But we could try and stop making things worse for households as well. So the rigorous pursuit of public debt isn't really helping anyone. When people are in debt to, for example, for council tax, the better local authorities, those that are more attuned to local people's needs, regard that as a warning sign that these families need help. Very few people are actively avoiding the payment of council tax. We could reduce the poverty premium, and I'm sure that Emma has a bit more to say about that. So it's expensive to be poor. It costs you more in terms of credit. It costs you more in terms of quite a number of other expenditures. We could reduce the cost of school day. There is excellent work done that across Scotland and, in fact, the UK, but it's patchy. So it shouldn't be a penalty in your education system to face exclusions, stigma, because you don't have the right kit, you don't have the right equipment, and you can't go and educational activities. So some of those, they might not actually have an impact on the targets, but they will have an impact on reducing mental stress, improving child well-being, and again, it's an investment in the future of our children.
Yeah, very briefly, one of the most unique things about going and getting advice from your local CAB is that you think you're going in to get advice on one thing, maybe social security, and get the opportunity to get a listening ear, a friendly face and a cup of tea, and the advisor's able to unpack all of the things that are happening in a household's life. And time again, it's issues that are colliding from everywhere that's making life completely difficult for families and forcing families and keeping them trapped in poverty. So we've heard of housing, childcare, transport would be another issue that I would raise, challenges with employers and lack of flexibility, energy costs. And from our observation, it does feel like there is a lack of coherence around the policy issues that are causing harm for families and how we are delivering joined up solutions in those spaces to actually lift people out of the challenges that they're facing. Stephen's absolutely right. Social security is the biggest lever that we could pull, but to really make a difference in families' lives, we've got to join up all of these issues because they're not happening in isolation. And then the final issue that I would raise is the difference of experience that families have who live in remote and rural communities. All of the issues that we've just described are even more profoundly felt if you're living in a remote or island community in Scotland. For example, on average, the energy debt that households have coming to Citizens Advice in Scotland is around £2,500. You go to a remote or rural community and that's £3,200. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of some of the issues. So we need to have a real focus on what the child poverty issues look like in remote and rural communities too.
Okay. Adele, do you have any last response? No. Thank you.
No.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Now, bit of a time check. Partly my fault because I spent so long on theme one, I think, as much as anything else. Time's catching up with us a little bit, so if I do step in and move things along a little bit, my apologies in advance. We now move on to the next theme, and Elena.
Thanks, Convener. I'm going to discuss the increased disability benefits caseload a little bit. Now, that's already been touched on quite a bit, so hopefully, in the interest of brevity, we'll just try and tease out some more responses to it. Now, I think if you look at the narrative out there, this can be seen in some quarters as a terrible thing, in other quarters as the best thing. And I think it's our duty here to try and actually look underneath those kind of screaming headlines that we see sometimes in newspapers. I think that leads to a toxic discussion round about it and perhaps knee-jerk proposed reforms. So I'm wondering, has there actually been any real research undertaken as to understand what is driving this increase in people applying for and being successful in receiving disability benefits right across the UK? Because we are seeing it in every place. Now, we've touched on some of them, and I don't know whether there's anybody would like to add any more kind of detail into that. That would be really helpful. Adele at all, or Chris after?
Well, let Adele go first.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very happy to. Again, during the course of the review, we looked at this and tried to unpick, or I looked at it, tried to unpick some of the reasons for the increase in caseload. And you'll see, again, if you read my report, and a lot of my report is referencing other people's reports, I should say. But if you look at things like the Scotland's economic and fiscal forecasts, they have done a piece of work looking into some of the reasons for the higher number of applications in Scotland when you compare Scotland to the UK. Although what I found, certainly the data that was available to me by the end of the review, which was sort of June, July time this year, that the difference, the gap actually between the rest of the UK and Scotland is narrowing. So there isn't a huge extra, a higher number of applications for ADP in Scotland. But the main reasons that people told me, so more sort of qualitative, conversation storytelling type of evidence, there was a lot of talk about mental ill health or mental health conditions is probably a better way of describing it. And without any doubt, I think some of the issues around people waiting for access to healthcare appointments and things, in some of the stories that was shared with me, that was a factor. I've already mentioned, obviously, the cost of living crisis, which I think was probably alerting people to the need to look at where they may be eligible for additional income. And I think in Scotland specifically, one thing came to light, which was during the review, which was because the Scottish Government policy to maximise take-up of ADP is to undertake what they describe as, or Social Security Scotland describe as, light touch reviews. This means that there's a decrease in the number of people who are exiting the caseload. So as well as looking at, additional people applying for ADP. We're seeing less people when compared to Department of Work and Pensions exiting the caseload because of that policy.
Very much. Chris, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it was just a couple of quick. I think one point that's worth making is, and it partly comes to the question about advice too, like getting ADP or PIP, even though the Social Security Scotland process is kind of friendlier, as it were, it's still a really invasive process. So people who are getting it are eligible for it, and it's right that they should claim it. But as we noted in our written response, it's a perfectly legitimate thing to try and ask, like, what's going on here? Because these are bad outcomes for people. People living longer with ill health is a bad outcome, and I think we do need to look at it. I know you had IFS here last week, and we commissioned them to do part of that work about looking at the caseload across the UK, and the reasons that Adele has just mentioned were, but we do need to look at it in a bit more detail. I think, it's quite a difficult thing to pin down, because there are so many different factors going on. COVID's impact on young people in particular, that's real. That's had real impacts. And when we work with people with lived experience, poor mental health is part of that experience, and the lack of community services are undoubtedly leading to the worsening of those issues that we could prevent and cut off at an earlier place. So absolutely support any efforts to get greater insight into this, because it will help us make better policy.
So what I'm hearing from both of you, and I think we've heard from the rest of the panel as well, is there's an element of failure demand driving up ill health conditions or exacerbating health conditions that then tip into a worsening health condition that perhaps lead people to apply for benefits that they maybe wouldn't have applied for before, but also underpinning that cost of living, driving people who perhaps wouldn't have applied in the past applying. Would that be a correct summation?
Yeah, I think it is a mix of all of those things. But just to underline that point is, you don't just walk into Social Security Scotland and somebody hands you ADP. You have to be eligible for it. You have to go through a rigorous process to get it. So yeah, it's the fact of that. But Stephen's already spoken about this. This talks to the broader impacts of poverty across our society, across demands for NHS services and all of these kind of things. Like how it's really difficult within the UK to compare a situation where we had a much more equal, much lower poverty society than we have today, and what impact that had on demand for other public services.
Yeah, I've heard a young person who is in receipt of high-level child disability payment actually question their own eligibility to it because of the narrative that's out there. So, I think that won't be an isolated case for that young person. I think there's a broader conversation round about the toxic narrative there. Emma, you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. Just some maybe more general reflection, I guess, in your question. I think it's really important for us to catch that disability can both be a consequence and a cause of poverty. And absolutely, we need to be taking measures to improve the health and well-being of our nation, full stop. And all action that can be taken there is a positive thing in and of itself, but of course then could have a positive contribution towards social security. But I think and a disabled person and disabled people's organisations would say this much more eloquently than I could put this morning, is that I think we just must need to catch ourselves and caution against the mindset that disability is something that can be cured, or that we can just make everyone well enough kind of in our society. The contribution that disabled people make to our society and to our economy is something that should be celebrated and valued, and additional cost disability payments are a really vital part of enabling disabled people to live full, thriving lives and contribute effectively to society.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Okay. Now, I note here that both Alexander and I think Jeremy wanted to come in this section. Jeremy said no. Alexander still wished to come in.
Thank you. I mean, you've touched on the criteria and making sure that disabled individuals are supported. And many individuals who have a disability want to work. And there are still difficulties in accessing that. There's still far too many barriers for disabled people to become or get the opportunity to get some kind of employment. And you've also touched on earlier, Emma, about the difficulties that you have in compare with the rural communities. And we know, for example, that in the Highlands or Murray or Orkney, etc., it's so much harder for a disabled person to be given employment opportunities. And the gaps that we see in those areas are really quite considerable. So more people trying to apply, I can understand that. But at the same time, what are we trying to do to change that cycle to ensure that people who want to work get the opportunity to have that opportunity of employment, and that then helps them progress through other areas within life and takes away from some of the stigma you've talked about this morning. So it would be good to get a view from the panel on how we tackle that, because if we manage to achieve some of that, it would see some more benefits in other areas, and it would also help the individual to progress. Whoever, Stephen, maybe first then.
Yeah, I agree with that. That diagnosis is spot on. I would emphasise very strongly that not that you're implying this, but this comes up at UK government level. The problem is not the benefit system. The problem, I'm afraid, is the job market, the labour market. We have jobs which are not fit for contemporary family life. They're not compatible with care, with where people live. We have some quite good employment support policies, but the No One Left Behind programme is not delivering for not only disabled people, but black and minority ethnic communities. Again, I would emphasise very strongly the value of collaborating with experts by experience and intermediary organisations. For example, Fife Gingerbread do excellent bespoke, tailored support for their particular community. That model is shown to be relatively cost effective. We need to reduce the barriers, so I'm afraid, again, a large investment in childcare is required. Childcare should be regarded equivalent to the education system. We don't regard that as an expense. We regard it as an investment in people. It's necessary for a modern economy. So there are other things that I say. There's a Fair Work programme that the Scottish Government is looking at. I have spoken on behalf of the Commission with the Institute of Directors and its business and the community, and they are quite supportive of some of these measures as well. So things like minimum standards across sectors, they have to be competitive, but a race to the bottom in our labour market doesn't help anyone. We have such agreements in construction. We could have them in the care sector. It's largely publicly funded. We should try and explore the capacity to have it in services like retail, tourism, and that would address, to a certain extent, the rural dimension. So we need to work with the partners in this and, again, try and aim at win-wins, which are good for employees and employers.
Thank you. Chris?
I mean, the tenor of your question is absolutely right. And I think we do need to, particularly within rural areas, for example, social care will often be a barrier to disabled people's participation in the labour market. And social care is more difficult to provide within rural areas. But I think councils and IGBs need to show more flexibility in the sort of models that because people can be employed in those as well. They're not seasonal services, which are often the nature of employment can be very seasonal within rural areas. So how councils can provide flexibility to allow local communities to provide social care, which disabled people can work with as well as benefit from. And I think these are the kind of things which, frankly, you won't design from within this Parliament. They have to be designed from within those communities, but they do require public funding and support, and they will, as you say, potentially have transformative impacts on people's lives.
Thank you. No, thank you.
And I apologise, just so we can land ending the committee at the appropriate time. Jeremy Balfour, you were leading on the next theme.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I mean, firstly, I think we would all want to give a big thank you to you, Adele, for all your work in regard to you and your colleagues have done. I think it will be very interesting not just to see how the government, but also every political party responds to your review. We could spend the next 12 hours discussing it, but I suspect I'm not allowed to do that. So let me limit myself just to a couple of questions, if that is okay. I mean, the first one is, a lot of what you come up is, you talk about the 50% rule, you talk about fluctuating conditions, you talk about the 20-metre mobility rule. If I was kind of to lock you in a room and say you can't come out until you tell us what is the first thing you would do from all your listening exercise, what is the one thing you would say from all of the good stuff that you've produced, you think the disability community would want to see happen first?
And I apologise, that's my house phone just going off, but it will stop in a moment. Apologies for that. That's such a tricky question to answer, as you probably would expect me to say. You'll see within the report, I mean, there's 58 recommendations, so being able to pick, one or two is pretty tricky. But if you look at the first three categories, they are to some extent all concerned with, I'm so sorry about the timing of this, all concerned with improving the client experience of the current system. So in other words, improvements that can be made to the systems and processes and experience within the current PIP eligibility criteria. So in terms of being the most effective, if you like, if I really was forced to sort of make a choice, then I would look at recommendations 41, 42, 55 and 56, one of which is about a comprehensive review of the eligibility criteria to make sure it reflects modern life and people's real experiences of living with a disability or a long-term health condition. Replacing the 50% rule, there was a huge amount of evidence and storytelling again and conversation around how the current eligibility criteria just do not work for people who live with fluctuating conditions. And then 55 is to do with planning and following journeys, and 56 is around the mobility component. Again, why do we have this 20-metre rule? If you read the report, which I'm sure you have, I go into that in a lot more detail, but it's a very arbitrary measurement when looking at people's mobility in the round. Where do they live? The type of environment they live in, access to public transport, all of these issues should be taken into account. So I can't choose one, but I can give you kind of four that would be at the top of my list.
That is really helpful, and thank you for that. If I can just go to two kind of specific things. And the first one is in regard to your review periods and whether they should be longer or phased out, particularly for those who have got permanent conditions. I mean, I'm interested that I'm personally up for review at the moment. Now, clearly, I think if I get two hands, it'll probably be the front of the Daily Mail. Is that a good use of taxpayers' money, that people that have permanent conditions are being called into review, rather than just saying, if something changes dramatically, then come back to Social Security Scotland?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one I asked during the course of the review. And I learned something personally. Well, I learned an awful lot through the process, but in the context of that particular question, I really learned something myself, because I'd come at that when I was asking the question exactly as you have just said, that there's a lot of people living with disability and long-term conditions. I have a son myself that has Fragile X syndrome. He is not going to be, that's not going to go away. So he's living with that as a long-term condition, as are you with your disability. And so I came at it exactly in the way that you've asked the question. But there was another side of the coin, which was that sometimes people's circumstances can change, and actually it may be that they're not on the higher rate component of either the mobility component or the daily living component, and doing a review is in their interests. But you'll see in the report that I do make a recommendation about review periods. Social Security Scotland does have sort of a list of conditions, and obviously they don't make decisions based on a disability or a condition. You'll know that. It's about the impact that that disability or condition has on someone's life. But they are looking at this all of the time. And if you look at the data that Social Security Scotland has, we are seeing that the maximum review period, which I think is currently 10 years, is being used in a lot of cases now. Some of that data I don't think is in the public domain. So I absolutely get your point, and you'll see within my report that I talk about review periods for long-term health conditions and disabilities, and that's one of the things I'm recommending should be re-looked at.
Thank you. My final question is probably slightly more controversial. I was interested in your report. You said it is evident that when consultations face-to-face occur, they play an important role in the decision-making process. Obviously, many people, and we've heard this from Emma Jackson, had a bad experience when they were going for their PIP face-to-face. do you think it's possible to devise a scheme where there is that face-to-face, but it's maybe not quite as confrontational or uncomfortable for the claimant that many people experience? Because, again, I'd be interested to get your view on this, that often if you meet somebody face-to-face, you can get a better view of actually how the disability affects them. And maybe that's the reason why so many people are successful at appeals, because they're actually then seen by people rather than just reading it as a paper case. Is it possible, in your view, to devise that way while making sure that people feel comfortable with it?
Again, a really good question, and something that came up consistently throughout the course of the review. And you'll see one of my recommendations is that the choice of whether or not to have a consultation should sit with the client and not with the case manager. And the reason for that is overwhelmingly pretty much nobody I spoke to during the course of the review, hundreds of people wanted to bring back the DWP style assessments. That was absolutely not on. And one of the things that I considered as an alternative to the current kind of point-based system was whether or not you could have a conversational type assessment. But the overwhelming majority of people that I spoke to absolutely categorically did not want to bring back assessments. So that was parked. But in the context of the consultation, what we heard was the way that consultations are being carried out, and they are only being carried out in the minority of cases and where the case manager doesn't have enough information to make a decision, that they're being done in a different way that isn't confrontational and is getting from the person the information that the case manager needs to make a decision. But I also heard from quite a lot of welfare advisors and disabled people themselves, I'd say particularly people with a learning disability, that actually they wanted to talk to someone. This was their life. This was a big decision that was going to be taken about their life that was really going to matter. And they felt that they were disadvantaged by trying to fill in a form and put their life story and the impact of their disability or long-term condition into an application form, and that they would like to have the opportunity to talk to somebody about their life, and they felt disadvantaged not being able to do that. So that's what led to my recommendation, not that we should bring back assessments or consultations for everybody, but that actually a case manager should make an offer to the client to say, would you like a consultation, and give them the opportunity to speak to somebody face-to-face.
Thank you. We could discuss this for a long time, but I'll leave it there, Convener, at the moment.
Thank you, Jeremy Balfour. Elena, back to yourself.
Thanks, Convener. Earlier we spoke a little bit about the proposed PIP reforms that were currently shelved. I'm wondering whether witnesses have any views on the likelihood of significant eligibility changes to PIP happening in the near future, and if that is to happen, how the Scottish Government actually plans for the financial impact that then would fall from those decisions. Yeah,
I'm happy to offer some reflection. So we're aware that the UK Government is carrying out the TIMS review right now. Mr Timms is looking at how to bring alongside disabled people and disabled people's organisations to have that sort of expert group to sort of help kind of guide the review. But one of the things they will be looking at is the eligibility criteria. We are keeping as close to that conversation as we possibly can as an organisation and trying to be actively involved so that we can really make clear in a totally unambiguous way to the UK Government the intersection that exists between PIP and ADP. I think that really wasn't clear when the welfare reforms were moving their way through the UK Parliament sort of in May, kind of June time, and there did seem to be a lack of understanding of the kind of analogous nature of PIP and ADP, in particular in relation to passporting, for example. So I think that anything that's happening at a UK level absolutely must have the voice of people in Scotland and organisations in Scotland really kind of clearly aligned. So there's that deep awareness of the impact of kind of potential decision making, both in relation to passporting, which we've already spoken about this morning, so I won't go over that again. But I think in a more pressing manner for us is what will be the outworkings of scrapping the WCA. How will people in Scotland be able then to access the health element of universal credit? Right now, that is we have no idea the answer to that question, and that is of deep concern to organisations, to disabled people, and of course to the Parliament and to the Scottish Government. So I could talk about this for a long time, and I know that we don't have a long time, but I think we really need to catch the intertwined nature still of PIP and ADP, and when changes are made at a UK government level, they absolutely impact here, despite our best aspirations for what we might want that payment to look like here.
I mean, if we look at the issue with the changes to the winter heating issues and the kind of guddle that everything, you know, falling out from that was such a big issue, this is an even more complicated issue if we think about the passporting and the intertwined nature of all of that. And, you know, from our perspective as a committee, how do we, you know, help scrutinise how the Scottish Government would respond to such changes should they come down the line, I think is a huge issue. Yeah, Chris?
I think it just comes to a broader point as well. Is now that the UK government have been a bit kind of rumbled on the reform here, it is vital that they sit down with the Scottish Government to work out some of the practicalities of it. We can't just be pulling these horrible rabbits out of a hat at the last minute, and they need to be working together. Because why don't both governments share with each other? It comes down to politics, as they want to make announcements and all of these kind of things. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the people who are in receipt of these payments, who have gone through fear for the last year and the stigma that they faced in the media. So I think it is incumbent on the UK government, as part of that Tim's review, with the new Secretary of State in charge, to really take a kind of very sober approach with the Scottish Government to discuss how this will impact on people in Scotland, because it will.
Thank you.
Who would like to come in as well? Understand? Adele Harris.
Adele, you want to come in? Yeah.
Just very briefly, I just wanted to take this opportunity to say that during the course of the review, I engaged with UK government, as you would probably expect me to, and I met with Sir Stephen Timms on 2 or 3 occasions, and also involved senior civil servants or senior people from the DWP in the review. He does, Sir Stephen Timms does have a copy of the both interim and the final report, and we are setting up a time to have a conversation in the next few weeks. So it was just really to let you know that obviously, you know, whether or not my report will have any bearing on their review is up to them to say, but they have a copy of the final report. And to be fair, they seem to have been very interested in the review as it was being conducted.
Thank you.
Okay. Jeremy, I think you were going to have a brief supplementary.
I mean, very briefly, I mean, maybe a question for Stephen, Chris, or Emma, really. Clearly, both governments have to, you know, make their own choices, and, you know, it's not for us to comment on that necessarily positively or negatively. But the big issue is the passporting, isn't it? If you get ADP, you passport into, is there any way of decoupling the passporting way, so that if a decision is made at Westminster or decision is made here in Holyrood that another government doesn't like, it doesn't then affect people's benefit? Can we decouple them, or is that just too complicated to look at?
Significant question to be answered briefly, but Chris, could you have, is it Chris that's going for it?
Okay, I'll go
Have
for
a go.
it. I mean, in theory, yeah, of course. I mean, but I think it needs to be done in partnership with the people who will be claiming. That's why the Social Security Scotland process took so long, because it was to be really careful to ensure that people transition from one into another. That's what should be happening with this too. So, yeah, sorry, that's not really answering your question. It is a tricky one, but the UK government do have to, as I say, sit down soberly with the Scottish Government to try and work this out for the benefit of the people who are eligible for those payments.
Okay, I'm just trying to squeeze in couple of very brief questions. I know Marie McNair wants to come back in as well.
Yeah, it was just, reading the written submissions. Obviously, Parkinson's UK were saying they were concerned about the pressure that will come in Scotland, to cut social security because of the UK agenda. Do you share those concerns?
I hope not. Yes, there are implications, but this is a gap that the Scottish Government and Parliament have stepped into quite a number of times. So, two-child mitigation shouldn't be necessary in Scotland. We shouldn't have to mitigate the benefit cap, the under-occupation penalty, and we should have a serious discussion about the serious deficiencies and design flaws of universal credit, which impoverish people. So the Scottish Government and Parliament have done the right thing by stepping into this. And I don't want to exonerate the steps that they could still take, but life would be made much easier if the UK Government addressed the issues that the current government have inherited but have not addressed yet. Hopefully the forthcoming child poverty strategy will recognise some of those and do the right thing.
Thanks for that, Stephen.
Any other comments on that?
Just very briefly, I think we haven't at all touched on universal credit as we've had the conversation this morning. And the completely intertwined nature for those who receive Social Security Scotland payments have then with being in receipt of universal credit, predominantly those who get advice on Social Security Scotland payments from a CAB are getting UC advice as well. There is a review of universal credit taking place at the moment, but that is a review that doesn't have a terms of reference or a scope, or a final report won't be produced. So it's really hard to understand the direction of travel of that piece of work and what outcomes that it will deliver. And so I think we always need to be really cognizant of what Stephen's described as how do we try to stop mitigating and using as much of our efforts as possible for those of us in the sectors that problems are addressed at source, so that this Parliament and Government can fulfil its ambition to do the things that it absolutely wants to do, so that we can look at tackling child poverty, eradicating poverty, making the lives of disabled people as full as we possibly can.
Is that you? Is you okay, Marie? Okay. Yep. So can I apologise for asking this at the very end? Like Mr Burtley, remember last year we asked a very similar question. There's £1.3 billion in positive policy initiatives in relation to mitigation as the Scottish child payment. I would split it in different ways. That money is now locked into this for that additional investment. If more money was to become available, I've just found £100 million. Where did that come from? Is it a cash-first approach? Is it provision of other services? Childcare was mentioned. How would you direct it? What would your priorities be? And I know you want to say all of the above, but that's not how it works. I know it's for politicians, but you're here today. What would your main ask be? One thing, if possible, Stephen.
In terms of the 2030 targets, the most urgent and immediate impact would be Scottish child payment increase. We'd also urge the Scottish Parliament and Government to give very serious consideration to the minimum income guarantee.
Okay, thank you. Emma?
I'll take both the Stephens and I'll give you a third and say the adequacy of ADP. Disabled people continue to experience some of the worst of poverty. We need to look at the adequacy of that payment.
Emma, thank you for the sneaking. I asked for one thing, Stephen asked for two. You took those and you added a third one. Chris, do you have anything you want to add?
I'll maybe just take theirs. I do the stuff, but the stuff around supporting people into work is, I think, there are families for whom social security is their route out of poverty, and so we need to focus on them through social security. But we are so piecemeal in our response at the moment around employability. It's messy. We're not well aligned with DWP. The local government is not around the table as much as it should be in these discussions. So much of everything that impacts on people's day-to-day lives and whether or not they're in poverty runs through councils.
Thank you, Chris. And Adele, last word to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, this is not wearing the chair of the independent review hat. It's really an answer more from my many years' experience of working in charities concerned with people with a disability, disabled people. And I would echo that point about employment. Obviously, ADP is not means tested, so it's not directly related to that payment. But there are so many people, disabled people, people with a learning disability, that's my experience, who could work and who have something to offer, and the systems and the right level of support just isn't there to help them to do that.
Okay. Can I thank all 4 witnesses for your time this morning? It's been quite a long session, but a really worthwhile one. That does end agenda item 3. We now move into private session for agenda item 4. Thank you, everybody.